Hi, welcome to Cost Control for Construction Projects. I'm Tom Stephenson, and today we are going to be looking at the second of two parts, which is on earned value analysis. We're going to use a simple case to walk us through how earned value analysis works conceptually. Essentially we're going to cover the basic principles of EVA, as it's also called. And we're going to look at how we apply it to a college campus case renovation, a fictitious sort of example. Through that example, we should be able to understand the principles of forecasts and trend lines that helps us to better analyze project performance. One of the things we have trouble doing in construction projects is really identifying performance issues early on and putting into a context of what does it mean to the overall project? If we continue along these trends, what potentially does this mean? And by having that kind of data, it will be another form of information that we can look at, analyze, and then work on trying to correct. And it probably will identify areas more readily that need more attention sooner rather than later. And that's an important feature in construction. We don't want to wait too long before we take action. How soon we are able to take remedial action and mitigation to improve our processes, improve our productivity rates, will greatly enhance our ability to reduce costs. So earned value analysis, there's really the three main values that we talk about in earned value analysis. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of factors in earned value analysis, but three values are what we call the planned value. Also, the older terminology, as I mentioned in the previous video, budgeted cost of work scheduled. Generally, we just say PV. Actual cost, AC, is the actual cost of the work performed. How much did it cost for what we just did? How much did it actually cost? It's different than, obviously, the budgeted cost. And earned value, also called budgeted cost of work performed, we're really looking at what are we earning for every dollar we're spending. It's a concept that it sounds simple, but I honestly feel it's hard to visualize because there's so many different abbreviations and equations that's involved with earned value analysis that sometimes you lose the forest for the trees. But you know what, the math isn't that complicated, and when you get past a certain point, then it starts to make sense. So don't be afraid if it kind of seems a bit confusing at first. Eventually it'll sink in, and then unless you're using it every day, you'll probably forget about it too. But those that actually use it all the time on projects, it becomes very intuitive to them, and they start to pick up on trends much more easily. And that's very, very helpful for visualizing things further out. And I would also say just having the basics of earned value analysis, even on projects that aren't really monitoring and deeply utilizing it, still gives you some visualization of what's going on and some understanding of what's going on in your projects, which can again help you to zone in and focus in on the sore points, the points where you're losing time, you're spending more than you expected, or a combination of both. And remember, it doesn't have to be both. It could be one, it could be the other, it could be the combination of both. So there's a lot of variables that come into play with projects. There are trends that certain ways that it typically goes. You know, I have a former vice president of a very large construction company that always had this saying, show me a project that's on time and I'll show you a project that's making money. Which typically means show me a project that's behind time, I'll show you a project that's not making money. So there's those two things that generally go in hand. Doesn't mean you couldn't have a project on time that is losing money, and doesn't mean you couldn't have a project that's a bit behind schedule that's actually doing pretty well cost-wise. So keep those things in mind. So number of EV calculations, and we're going to go through these in our example. So I'm not going to go spell them out, but you know, you might want to freeze this and take a look at them and just sort of walk yourself through them. But we're going to run through them in an actual example, as I said, for that. But these are some of the formulas that we utilize to get at certain information. And once we have a certain amount of the information in place, then we can actually keep going with the details just by manipulating the formulas. And as we kind of showed you in the previous video, if you haven't seen it, I'll put it in the description notes below. We have plan value, we have earned value, right? And so this was the plan. This is basically what we are earning. So this is the earned value amount. So in other words, we're really not as far along as we expected to be as far as the actual work that's done or the money that's being spent on the project. And that's obviously, that's affecting our time. We're over our budget. So if we're looking at our actual cost where we're at, because there's these two factors that we have to look at, that gives us a variance in cost at completion, and it can give us a variance in time at completion, depending where these are on these trend lines. So it's something to sort of sit at and look at and contemplate. And of course, the status date is the date wherever you are on the project. Are you 1 month in, 2 months in? Typically on larger projects, we do a formal update once a month. So earned value analysis would be done in those cases once a month to really get a handle on how things are proceeding. Of course, within the short-term schedules, you're always looking at other factors. And if you're into lean construction, you're monitoring different other factors like percent plan complete, etc. So there are other factors that come in, but that's not really earned value analysis. Earned value analysis is following this process here. So we have this college campus remodel, and I did mention it in the previous video as well, sort of to illustrate things, but we're going to kind of walk through it very methodically in this video. So we have an infill project, baseline duration 100 days with a $10 million cost of $10 million. The project's being updated at day 50 duration. Everything is done for simplification in this model so that you can sort of extrapolate and run the easy math on it even in your heads. So that's why I've kept it fairly simple, because you start doing that, then you start visualizing the formula, and then whatever the numbers are, they are, and you're just plugging them in reality. The actual cost of work performed to the status date is $6 million. So we're at day 50. That would be at the halfway point. And I'm assuming a linear spending of the money in the plan value. So that would mean that you're at $50 million. The reality is your plan could have been that you've only spent $40 million if that was the original plan. It's whatever the original plan is. But I've kept it linear. So in this case, it's at $50 million. It would at $5 million at the 50-day point. The actual cost of work performed, though, at that 50-day point is $6 million, and you haven't even done 50% of the work. You've only done 40% of the work. So that's those changes, right? Like, it doesn't mean because we've done $6 million, we've done 60% of the work. No, I'm saying in this case, we've only actually done 40% of the work. Whereas our plan value would have said that we would have done 50% of the work. So you can see there's these dichotomies that are occurring between the different values. So the plan value is the budget baseline amount for the task. And, in other components in this series of videos, we've definitely gotten into the setting of a baseline. Baseline for time, baseline for cost. That allows us, from a cost controls perspective, to measure how we're doing at specific points in time. But we haven't really gotten into, yes, we've spent this much, or we're this much behind. We haven't gotten into how much value are we getting out of the money that we spent, right? We haven't been getting into that component of it. So this includes, the plan value includes the costs of any resources assigned to the task, including hourly rate and any fixed cost. These amounts would already be included in a cost-loaded baseline and can be done to varying levels of detail. The lower the level, the deeper the analysis can be, for sure. And, in a lot of cases, earned value analysis might be done at higher levels in the work breakdown structure, not too high, but a little bit higher than on the activity basis, depending on how the project is being monitored for those purposes. So there's a lot of different ways, and there's certain rules around best practices of utilizing earned value analysis that need to be followed, depending on the requirements of the contract too. Very often it is a contract requirement. And as I said in the previous video, You'll typically find these types of projects when you're looking at infrastructure projects or heavy industrial projects. It's the norm. If you're looking at commercial projects and residential project is not the norm. So there's that difference where in construction it's used. So if you're in like low-rise residential, you're not going to be seeing this. If you are in, building transportation systems or hydroelectric dams, you're going to see this. So the college remodel is simply simplified for these purposes. As I said, we're updating the schedule, has a single task to day 50. The budgeted cost of work scheduled is 50 days, so 0.5 or 50%. If we take the percentage that the project is planned to be completed and multiply it by the total project amount, the result of the planned value of work in that case would be $5 million based on the planned value of the work at day 50 of the schedule. With a schedule, as I mentioned, that has multiple activities, this would be computed for each cost-loaded activity up to the status date. So you would know what that's supposed to be. So plan value equals baseline costs entered for tasks up to the status date. The actual cost is what it sounds like, that have been incurred completing tasks or portions of tasks up to the status date. Keyword there, status date. Date we're updating the schedule to, in this case, day 50. So we're updating to day 50 and we're saying we actually incurred $6 million in costs. Therefore, the actual cost of work performed during the first 50 days is $6 million. This information would be derived directly from the actuals occurring on the site. That's why it also requires good measurement in the updating process. In the previous video, I kind of went into the aspect of don't be doing earned value analysis if you're not really even setting good baselines and following best practices for schedule development, cost loading, etc. There's a lot of best practice documentation through the Project Management Institute and others that give guidelines around this. But if you're not at that level, which we would call typically like a level 3 of schedule management, earned value analysis, you're loading stuff and you're measuring stuff that probably is not accurate at all. So what are you looking at? Garbage in, garbage out, so to speak. That's why you see it on large projects, infrastructure projects, where you have people that are dedicated to making sure that these costs are tracked and that they're applied correctly and that they're reviewed. So AC equals total costs incurred at the status date. The EV is typically the most difficult to visualize, as I said, but I think if you want to think about it, and this is where the cost performance index comes in, and the schedule performance index can be quite helpful as a percentage review. But if you think about it, this is the value for every dollar that you're spending that you're getting out of the project. So in our example, when we look at it, it's the value of the budgeted cost of work performed measured in dollars as of the status date. So in our example, we have only completed 40% of the project, complete as of the status date, instead of the planned outlined under the PV of 50%. Then the EV would be 40% of 10 million. So that's giving us a result of $4 million. This is the value that's been earned on the project as of the status date, utilizing the baseline budget price of 10 million. So we've earned 4 million, right? If we're thinking back to what the planned value was, we should have been earning 5 million. This is not looking too good, right? It is expected that if the activity is only 40% complete and the total cost of the activity is 10 million, then the earned value is 4 million. For a project with multiple activities, this is entered for each individual activity up to the status date. In this case, we're saying it would total 4 million. That's not looking too good. So we know that according to the values provided in the PV at day 50, we plan to incur 5 million, 50% of the 10 million. The EV as of the status date is only 4 million. This tells us the task is behind schedule. In other words, less value has been achieved than planned as of that date. The actual cost number of 6 million tells us that the task is also quite substantially over budget. Now, there could be a variety of reasons why this has occurred. You'd want to look at it and try to figure out why these issues are occurring. And you could hone in, of course, if you have the individual activities, because maybe 75% of your activities are going well, but you have 25% of the activities that are problematic. And that for sure you would want to dive into that. We're all the way at day 50. You know, the truth of the matter is maybe you'd be at day 30, you do your first update, you would see it earlier on a project that's multi-year, which very often is what it is with earned value analysis. Month by month, you're seeing these and you're getting these flags, and that's giving a lot of attention to those areas. Especially, say you're doing a big infrastructure project, it could require hundreds of thousands of cubic meters or cubic yards of earth to be moved, and you're seeing that there's a productivity issue in there. Well, that's where now's the time to work on it, because if we don't work on it, we can also measure and see how this trend will play out on the rest of the project, which can give us valuable data that says, get your act together sooner, what's going on. So there could be a variety of reasons, as I mentioned, and that further analysis will allow you to be proactive. So there's a lot of terminology involved, and that's half the battle, I find, is just getting used to the terminology. And if you're thinking of doing your project management professional certification at some point, you have to memorize all those formulas. You really do. And I would say it's not so much that you have to, in the beginning, it's that you kind of have to memorize them. But really, you know, I've been educating for a long period of time, and, you know, it's kind of old school to say memorize things, because that doesn't necessarily help you, especially when you try to do it on a short-term basis. But what I would say with earned value analysis, having done that at certain periods of time, and to be quite honest with you, I don't have them all memorized in my head because I don't use it enough. I teach a lot of different things. But I did have to learn it, because when I did my own PMP, it required that pretty much for about a month and a half, every day I'd write down the formulas, see how many I could write down, and then I would add more, and I would add more. And actually for the PMP, I think, I'd have to look up in my journal, but I think that there was probably around 35, 38 formulas, not just earned value analysis, but with other formulas that you really kind of needed to remember. But you know what? Through memorization, then you start to picture it. And it's kind of like you got these little nodes in the little gray cells in the brain, and then the dots start to connect. And then a lot of them, when you start to know what the abbreviation is, it's like, wait a minute, I don't even have to remember this. I just have to know that, well, if I've got this and I've got that, well, if I subtract this from that, of course, it's going to give me this variance. Or if I divide this by this, of course, it's going to give me this cost performance index. So it starts to give you the data and information, and then it starts to form together, and it's very helpful. I know for myself, having come from a trade background originally, before I did all the business studying and degrees, when you can picture how things work, then it's much easier than memorization. But sometimes you have to memorize certain things before you turn the corner on these things. So that can be helpful that way. Otherwise, you're just plugging in numbers. You know, if you have all the formulas, you just plug in the numbers, but you really are not sure what's going on. And so it's trying to picture and visualize it that's helpful. And that's why I usually find simpler examples are the best to bring that home. And then another video that I'll shoot, I'll just run through just a simple calculation exercise so that you can actually try it yourself. The next few slides, so we'll look at this college case example. Budget at completion. What was budgeted for the total project? In other words, use the total baseline cost for the project. So this differs from plan value in that budget at completion is always for the whole project, while plan value is for the tasks as of that particular status date. So in this case, our plan value for day 50 is 5 million, but the budget at completion is always to the end of the project, right? If the status date was at the end of the project, well, the plan value and the budget at completion at that point would be the same. But plan value can change depending on when you're measuring it to. Am I measuring at day 40? Am I measuring at day 50? Am I measuring at what was our plan value at those points? And you're adding up the baseline that you'd set for all those activities up to that status date. And that is the plan value as of the status date. So the budget at completion, total project baseline budget. I'll just take a sip here. Schedule variance. Schedule variance is determined by taking the earned value and subtracting the PV as of the status date. So the earned value as of the status date and subtracting the PV. If the number is negative, then the project is behind schedule. If the number is positive, then the project is ahead of schedule. So for our case, the college case, we have earned value is 4 million and PV is 5 million. So when we subtract earned value minus the planned value, we have a schedule variance of minus $1 million, which means it's significantly delayed. You know, visualizing that doesn't really give you, what does he mean? We're talking time, but it's showing money. That's where we can use the schedule performance index that's coming up, because we need this number to utilize the schedule performance index, because then we can look at it from a percentage basis of how we're proceeding on the project. So we need this to be helpful in giving us other information. But when I see a negative number, and I see a big negative number compared to the planned value, I'm thinking this is not good. This is not good. So the cost performance index is, it's because we've done basically the earned value with that minus the planned value. The cost performance index is where we start looking at the cost as a percentage. So the CPI is determined by taking the earned value and dividing it by the actual cost as of the status date. So we've got the earned value divided by the actual cost as of the status date. And so over here, we've got our schedule variance, we've got our earned value, which is $4 million, right? And we know what our actual cost is. So we had that derived, which was 6 million. So you can think of the CPI, and I'm just throwing out numbers here. If the CPI is at 0.95, then the project is getting 95 cents out of every dollar spent. It's giving it to you now. You can sort of visualize it. I think you can visualize it much better when you start thinking about CPI. Kind of makes a lot more sense to me that way, 0.95. So we're getting 95% out of every dollar that we spend. Well, that's not really good, because we would want to get 100% in that particular example that I'm just sort of saying, if it's 0.95. Our example, if the CPI is at $1.15, then the project is getting $1.15 out of every dollar spent, which is positive. That's great. So that's really good. Probably should have put a separate bullet here. So if you're having trouble with that, I would take this as a different bullet. So in our case, the EV is 4 million divided by the actual cost of 6 million. This gives us a CPI of 67%. We're getting 67 cents out of every dollar we spend. Not great. So our case project is only getting that 67 cents out of every dollar. That's not a good thing. Not a good thing. That's a terrible thing. So the estimate at completion, what do we currently, as of now, expect the total project to be? To perform the estimate at completion calculation, you take the budgeted actual cost and divide it by the CPI. So that would give you basically the CPI, the actual estimate EAC at completion. Now there's different ways to do that, though. You can. This is using sort of the worst case scenario, right? So this is just giving us the worst case scenario necessarily with the estimate at completion, because with this you're assuming you're going to continue along this trend line. which is good to do as an exercise. It may not be that, because maybe whatever happened, you're done that part of the work. It was a one-off thing, and that's not in the rest of the project, so there's no way that trend will necessarily go forward. But you know what? In a lot of projects, if you start off in the hole and behind, and you don't do something, and you don't take proactive steps, and you don't really work with your project team at mitigating this, history, like George Santayana says, history tends to repeat itself. If we don't learn from our past, we tend to repeat it. If we don't learn what got us into this mess, we tend to repeat it. But I will qualify that. It kind of does depend on the type of work that's coming up, but don't minimize that effect, the George Santayana effect, in project management. You definitely want to be understanding what's going on. So this gives you a pretty good reality check. So we can utilize the EAC to forecast the following trend that will estimate the cost at completion. So we take our 10 million, divide it by 0.66, whatever, 6667, however many you want, decimal points you want to get. At a certain point, it won't make a big difference. $15 million. The ability to apply the CPI in the EAC formula to forecast the overall estimate at the completion it's a useful tool that provides perspective. And once again, I'll bring up Stein's law. A trend will continue until it stops. So the idea is you're seeing it, let's make it stop in this case. Let's change direction on it. So BAC, budget at completion, divided by CPI. It gives you the estimate at completion. And again, there are some workaround and other examples of EAC. So those of you that are studying for the PMP, you may want to look into a little bit more of these ones. It doesn't go, honestly, unless something's changed in the PMP, it doesn't go too drastically into the other options, but I think it's valuable for you to know those other points as well. All right, there we go. I forgot I put this in. There are actually many ways to calculate it. Other methods include actual cost plus bottom up to ETC, estimate to complete. So that means you've done your actual costs up to the status date, and now you're re-estimating the rest of the project. You're re-estimating the rest of the project. You're taking into account things that you can't do anything about, but you now know this. Maybe the estimate was bad to begin with, but this would give you definitely estimate at completion. And as long as you don't have the planning fallacy going on, when that would be Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, when you're developing this part, bottom up to estimate to complete. Like if you're not being overly optimistic, you're being realistic with your new knowledge up to the status date, this will give you a very good estimate at completion, right? It could actually give you a better value than obviously the original estimate if it was flawed. If the original estimate's good, you're really just checking it over again, if you want to look at it that way. You could also do actual cost, and you could have the budget at completion minus the earned value. So the budget at completion, so actual cost plus, you've got the budget at completion minus the earned value equals the estimate at completion. It calculates the actual cost to date plus remaining budget amount. This is used when the current variances are thought to be unusual and not typical of the future. So it gives you a different take on it. So there are different ways that you can look at the estimate at completion. For our purposes though, I think this is, in our example, the easiest one to visualize when you're first starting out. And then when you get beyond that, you can start looking and understanding these other. For the estimate to complete, how much more will it cost to complete the project? All right, this differs from the estimate at completion, which is, in other words, in that it is determining the cost of completion from the status date to the end of the project. So to perform this calculation, simply take the estimate at completion and subtract the actual costs incurred at the status date. So we take EAC, which is 15 million, and we minus 6 million, and that's going to give us $9 million. So the estimate to complete is $9 million. So really, what we're saying is if you know what the estimate now is at completion, which in this case we've worked out is 15 million. Now that it's so much more money when we ran that number, right? When we went back a few slides here and we ran that number and we got the estimate at completion of 15 million, we're going to subtract our actual costs, which we know was 6 million. So then that gives us the estimate to complete in that case, assuming that we used that formula that we came up with the 15 million. So you can see how this is not that difficult to sort of put together. All right, yeah, we got 15. We're estimating at completion is 15. We spent 6 million. We got 9 million more to spend. Just moving the date completion. And the variance at completion is another one that you can more or less do in your head. It's your budget at completion minus your estimate at completion. So in our case, we have our $10 million budget, and we're going to subtract our estimate at completion, which is 15 million. 10 million minus 15 million gives us a negative 5 million. Not a good thing. Minus 5 million means this project really is a disaster. So that's not a good thing. So we got a very large variance at completion from a cost perspective. Now let's take a look at the SPI, the Schedule Performance Index. And I'll go back to my friend, the vice president, who said, show me a project that's on time and I'll show you a project that's making money. Well, guess what? This project's not on time and it's not making money. So Schedule Performance Index, that is looking at basically, again, how are we doing time-wise, duration-wise for our activities, for the time that's being spent on our activities. And if we take the SPI and it's at 80.85 or 85%, then the schedule is moving at 85% the rate that was originally planned. So this would mean the schedule's falling behind. I did mention in the previous video, it's not always like exactly on the critical path. So it would kind of be project specific because you could have a lot of activities that are falling behind, but they're not all critical, and that could influence the overall schedule performance index data. But it's a really good, overall, generally, it's a really good indicator that way. So I usually like to visualize it in this context. So if the schedule is only moving at 85%, that would be if we do the SPI, where we take the earned value and divide it by the planned value, right? Then essentially we're taking our 4 million and dividing it by 5 million. That's giving us 80%. So in this case, the project schedule is therefore moving at 80% the rate that was planned. Not a good situation overall. Not a good situation overall. So we can take those numbers and we can utilize them even further if you just want to visualize it a little bit. Time estimate at completion, right? Time estimate at completion. If we take our schedule at completion, so we've got our 100 days, and we divide it by 0.8, that works out to 125 days. Estimated time for completion. It gives you sort of a perspective. Like I said, that's not rocket science clear data because you've got the anomalies of areas that have float, but I think it's a good indicator to sort of visualize, especially if you're having kind of trouble visualizing. What does he mean by 80%? It means that if when you apply it, it is dramatically impacting your project finish date, and that you want to do a very careful analysis of your revisions and your recoveries to get this project back on track, particularly projects that have liquidated damages that are very time sensitive. They could have other punitive measures that are going to dramatically impact you beyond even the $15 million cost that would have to be calculated in there. So there's other spin-off effects of things that we've talked about in this course in other areas. So time variance at completion. So we've got time estimate at completion. Now we've got time variance at completion. And so if we take our time estimate at completion and we take our minus our schedule at completion, right, data. So we've got our 100 days and we're going to take our time estimate at completion. We've got our 100, so we've got our our 125 days minus our 100, that's going to give us our time variance of 25 days there. So we're just plugging in the numbers at this point, just giving us better understanding of overall things that are going on. So just to run through maybe with some visual examples in a schedule, the following slides sort of are a bunch of screenshots given at the different points in time, and gives you sort of a sense of the data being calculated. All right, so you can sort of just running through these points that I just kind of mentioned. So you got this campus remodel, and there's a few things I would do differently in this illustration, but essentially you've got 100 days. You've got your actual duration 40 days, your remaining duration 60 days, and your actual cost $6 million. You've got $10 million. I don't usually use fixed costs, but for this simple example, I did. And you've got your total cost at $12 million. So you've got this campus remodel that's going on, and that's giving you a variance of $2 million. This is just giving you straight out amounts of calculations. We've got our campus remodel. We've got a start variance of 0 days and a finish variance of 10 days as of the update period. This would be just like with regular sort of updates that was going on the project. So this is just showing how this is sort of playing out with regular updates. But when we actually look at it with the earned value analysis data put in, we have our planned value at 5 million, our earned value at 4 million, our actual costs at 6 million, gives us a schedule variance of 1 million, a cost variance of 2 million, an estimate at completion of 15 million, a budget at completion of 10 million, and a variance at completion of 5 million. So this is all the data that we were going through earlier. So we have a planned value of 5 million, an earned value of 4 million. We have a cost variance of 2 million as of that particular status date. Well, the cost variance between our 6 million and our 4 million, right? So we have that 6 million, $4 million dollar difference. So that's where that cost variance is coming in, 6 million minus the 4 million. So our cost variance percentage is 50%. Our CPI is 0.67. So that's that number that we calculated there. Our budget at completion, 10 million. Our estimate at completion, 5 million. And our variance at completion, 5 million. So all of this is also, if we're looking at it in a different table, we're looking at our planned value. And again, it's got the original definitions there, 5 million. Earned value 4 million, as we mentioned. Schedule variance 1 million. That gives us minus 20% or 0.8 as we did the calculations there. So depending on how you're looking at the data there. So we're essentially only getting 0.8 of a day out of every day that we work, if you want to look at it that way, or we're behind 20% in our schedule. So it kind of walks us through using a software, how scheduling software would typically be utilized, cost loading of scheduling software. If it's Primavera, it's probably if it's those kind of infrastructure projects in construction, typically it's going to use a program like Primavera P6 to do that. It's a little bit, I think it's a little bit much for a Microsoft project in those cases. While I think Microsoft Project's a great program for a lot of things, generally you're going to see those types of infrastructure projects where in construction it requires careful, detailed analysis to be done. Primavera P6 is typically the recommended program. So really it helps us to purposely work towards resolving those issues. It'll help the client. Also, you know what? Like it depends on the type of project. It may be multifaceted, multi-phase. There's tax dollars at stake, billions of dollars in these large infrastructure projects. It's one way to then look at the rest of the project as in the rest of the phases that are coming up and perhaps look for cost savings and redesign issues. If it's maybe not even that it's necessarily the contractor's fault, maybe it is a budgetary issue. Maybe the work has kind of grown, we had scope creep on it. It's a good opportunity too to look at the rest of the project, and perhaps that might institute some redesign to try to get the overall budget back in alignment. So the client or government agent, and usually they're the biggest drivers of why you want to have earned value analysis in place and helping that way. Now, I did mention from the beginning, the goal is to stop trends early and to mitigate these issues. So then we got to fall back on all the other things that we've been doing in this particular course. Once we've identified areas where we've got issues, then it gets down to, well, why are we not getting the productivity out of this? Or, is it site logistics? Is it the resources that we're utilizing? Is it that we have too many people in a small area, or we don't have enough equipment? Is it a methodology issue? We've got to be looking maybe at the 8 areas of waste, such as using lean protocols. We could be instituting other areas like the 5 S's and trying to get a better understanding of that. So there's all these different elements that we have to look at, and can we better engage the people that we're involving. If you've seen what I've talked about in previous lectures, I'm a fan of lean construction. So I would be also looking at, well, are we instituting the last planner system? Are we getting the full effectiveness out of this? Is there ways to better utilize this in our management of the programs? Ideally, you want to do this before you start the project, but still, you are going to be looking at ways to make improvements and control costs through this process. So hopefully that's given you a good introduction to earned value analysis, and stew on it and take a look at it a bit. If you're studying for the PMP, I think the best is to look at some simple examples like this and try to visualize it. There's some really good materials out there where you can actually study materials that have simple examples that you walk through. And on a PMP test, they can only go so complicated. They can't go very complicated with the examples because you don't have the time to do it. But you do have to know how the formulas work. And in a succeeding video, I will have a simple example that we'll set up and we'll walk through, and we'll see how you do. Okay, I'm Tom Stephenson, wishing you a wonderful day and happy project management and cost control out there. See you next time. Bye for now.